everybody, what's up? It's Joel, aka The Daily Guru. Today on Gabbing with the Guru, I have one of the best guests I've ever been able to book. I am beyond excited to bring you this conversation. When it comes to people who are true music obsessives and run the gamut in terms of taste and impact, there are few people more important than Terry Stewart. For 14 years, he was the president and CEO of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame here in Cleveland, Ohio. He knows about as much as anybody about music. We're going to answer some of the questions you guys sent in. I guarantee you guys are going to dig this, so stay tuned. So what was your first exposure to music?
Well, it goes back to the 40s, and early was radio. I was always a kid that I'd rather listen to music on the radio than play with other kids. In fact, I would come in out of the yard in the afternoon to listen to the late afternoon radio programs. One artist particularly, Eddie Arnold, who had a 15-minute program. Kind of ironic, one of my friends who's from Cincinnati, his mother had actually been on the Eddie Arnold show. They'd taken transcriptions and put them on CDs for us, so I have a whole collection of those shows I listened to as a kid, which probably aren't available anywhere else. Yeah. I actually sang with Eddie Arnold in 1949. It's the first live show I went to, and he had a big hit called Big Bouquet of Roses, and my mother wasn't watching me, and I sat at the end of the aisle, and I wandered down the aisle and started belting it out. It was the final song of the show, and he came down and sang with me, and I guess it's probably 8 or 9, 10 years ago before he passed away. I met him at the Congressional Medal of the Arts Center, and people asked me about what did I say to the people I meet. I said, well, really, running a rock hall, I didn't really always go out of my way to meet who came in the building. The main thing was for the curators and the educators to form a relationship, because those are the people that really need to work with them. I mean, I'd say hello if the manager felt I should need them. If those people asked me to go talk to them about something, I would. But so I go over to Eddie Arnold, sitting by himself, and I know better than to do this. And I pour out my heart about this little boy who sings with him, Big Bouquet of Roses, and he looked me in the eye so sincerely, put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, "Young man, do you know what time supper is?" And that sort of goes back to, what are you going to say to most of these people? Right. If it isn't a real conversation about something that is sort of instantaneous or something, it comes out of some conversation that's really not very meaningful to these people. So anyway, so and then listening to the radio, starting to buy records in 1951, obsessively doing that and going to shows as a young kid. When I was 12, my mother started letting me go to movies by myself, which meant I had to ride a bus. I grew up in a wide spot in the road in Alabama called Daphne, which is a little bit bigger now, but the only movie theaters were 30, 40 miles away, and I would go all day to the movies after cutting yards and go to the record stores and go to listening booths and listen to records and buy one record. That's all I could afford, $1.45 at 99 cents. We didn't have cheap records in the South. They were up here in the North and in New York, they were 69 cents, they were 99 cents. So I'd spend all afternoon trying to figure out which one to buy. But she also then, shortly thereafter, started letting me go to the R&B shows, all black shows. I met Ray Charles, I met James Brown early on in my life, changed my life. And so people ask, why do I think? It's just a breakdown in the DNA, or it's the way the helix is spun in my life. It's just always meant more to me than almost anything else. But pop culture, comic books, obviously, movies, all meant a lot to me. So that sort of a fantasy world, another world that you live in.
Those early shows that you were seeing, how big were they?
I couldn't go to clubs per se. I had to go to these, and they didn't have any arenas, and they had some armory shows. I went to famous armory shows in Mobile, and it'd be maybe, I'm gonna guess, maybe 1,000 people there, maybe 800. And later on, I started when the shows shifted to the Mobile arena, the big shows. But then I started in college. When I was at Rutgers undergraduate, I was both president and social chairman of my fraternity. So I booked the bands. And then we had a band every Saturday night. At Rutgers, it was legal to drink underage, so girls would show up and could dance to a band and drink beer legally. Somewhere around 11:30, before the band shut down, I'd get my car and go to the Apollo or the Uptown in Philly, the Mosque in Newark, and another theater down in Trenton, and see a lot of rhythm and blues shows. So I always had done that.
Sure.
I also went into some of Warhol's first clubs in New York, right in '65, and that sort of thing. But I didn't spend a lot of time in those clubs. The bands, whether it's Velvet Underground or whatever, they didn't interest me as much as the R&B scene did.
Were you conscious of when the shift kind of started moving from R&B into rock and roll?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it really the sea change is the Beatles. I mean, when you really think about it. I bought the Beatles album, the Capitol album, in January of '64, and I wrote on the back of it because they had 5 of the top 10 hits or whatever it was at the time, which was unheard of, and I wrote on the back Beatlemania 1964 _. And if my records were here behind us, you could see that. And I, of course, fell for all the British stuff.
Sure.
I didn't give up on the R&B stuff, but it shifted me back to more of sort of white music in general, rock music. I never gotten away from it, but that period, as they want to kid about today, the music died with Buddy Holly in '59. I was, from there until '64, I was listening to, you know, obviously pop radio, terrestrial radio, which had both. In those days, it would have, you know, soul records right next to rock records, or Perry Como or Eddie Arnold. Again, whatever was popular. So it was a mix. We didn't silo stuff in those days per se.
So with the rest of the popular culture that you've been involved in throughout your career, music's kind of always just been the thing.
Yeah, that was the constant. I mean, comic books were always in and out of my life, and I was lucky enough to get the job running Marvel because they were looking for somebody with a business background who actually read comic books, which was me. And it was me and a guy in Utah, I tell you. It was a very small subset of people. And they wanted the business to be driven to a great extent by the collectability of the product. Hence all the multiple covers and things that drove a lot of kids and a lot of people crazy, both good crazy and bad crazy. Movies are something I tried to find a way to get to Hollywood, but I didn't have anything on the creative side. It would have had to been on the business side, and it just never happened. So music was something that always kept me going. I always had this craziness about records, and as I made more money, I pissed more money away on it. That's just the way it works. And I was, you know, make 100 and spend 200.
Right.
But, you know, but that was the constant. So when Marvel, when that was over, one of my friends called me one day. I was doing consulting in New York and said, "I just saw your next career," and it's in the Wall Street Journal, and I read 4 papers a day, and I read the Journal every day. And I said, "I read the Journal, I didn't see anything." And he says, "Look in a certain place." Well, he had a later edition than I did. He was in Pittsburgh. I was in Connecticut. So I went and got a later edition and found out that the job here at the Rock Hall was open. So I was just starting to date my wife. She made a video of all my stuff because I had a big house that had all this crap everywhere. And then I wrote them about 1,000 pages of paper telling them I had to have this job and everything. And so, like it sometimes turns out in life. It worked out and I got it. So
what has been for you over the course of the time at the Rock Hall? What's been the most rewarding or enjoyable moment there?
Well, I don't know if there's any one moment. I think the most rewarding is a very sort of blanket statement that I tell people, and I mean is that it means that I had a small little bitty role in memorializing this music that changed my life, because most of us don't ever get a chance to give back truly to it, whether it's maybe having a small role in getting some of my idols inducted, or the fact that I was able to convince some to give me material that the museum would display forever. It makes me feel good that maybe they'll always live in, you know, eternally in one sense. We've actually made the museum very financially sound. We built our library and archives, which is a separate facility which will preserve and give a place to study. And again, we define rock and roll as, you know, drum beats from Africa. This is river music that continues to evolve. It drives everybody crazy that we include soul, hip hop, EDM. Everything is in there. It all comes from the same place, whether you like it. It didn't come out of the Gershwin, Cole Porter songbook, is what I say. It came out of the Presley, Bill Haley, Beatles songbook. That's where it came. And it, you know, even ABBA, which is just simply Elvis and the Beatles translated through Swedish, the way they heard it and the way it comes out. And that's, you know, you don't have to like it. And the whole idea that that's pop music, and pop meant popular. And when that term was first used, it happened to refer to the most popular records. Now, there was a race chart over here. And then it became a rhythm blues chart. And then that all sort of got melded. But the fact is that if you want to talk about pop music, it's actually probably EDM and hip-hop. Those are the popular genres of the world. That's what really floats more boats than anything else. In terms of rock and roll, we take that broad view of it, and most musicologists do the same. So the Library and Archives allows us to sort of preserve as much sort of original source material as you can about where this music came from and what impact it's had. And that just being able to say I had a part in getting that built, and that will be there for all times is very important to me.
So working off of that, what is the actual process for an artist to get inducted? How do the artists get picked?
Well, it's very methodical, it's very disciplined, and it's gotten more refined over the 20-something years that the Hall of Fame has been in existence. But there's a nominating committee for the performer category, which is the one that most people pay most attention to. And there are about 40 of us on that committee. I'm lucky enough to be one of them. They are very knowledgeable people. They're people you've known and heard of, like Little Steven, Paul Schaefer, John Landau, who's Springsteen's manager, Seymour Stein, who started Sire Records and actually started in his teens working at King Records in Cincinnati. The only hard criteria for performer is you have to have a recording 25 years ago. Now, it's kind of tricky, getting it tricky at some point, knowing when a band had their first recording. If you go, in fact, I even tried to start something in a museum where a band would send us their first recording and automatically the clock would start tolling. We're still working on that. And we would have that in the library. In a hard drive, we'd have your first recording. And who knows? Somebody that sent in would eventually become famous.
One of those is going to be a winner, yeah.
So anyway, so you've got nominators, and they can bring in 3 acts, 25 years since their first recording. And you can't talk about popularity, gold records, number of hits. You have to talk about impact, influence, innovation, and excellence. Why is this artist or this group important, and why should they be inducted? And I'll grant you, and this is a little bit of an argument that I've had and others too, is that if you sell a gazillion records and fill up arenas, that you probably had some influence based on that. So indirectly, you do have that play its role in, but you can't come in and say, well, this group had, thank goodness Rush is finally getting inducted this year. If I were still running the museum, that means there'd be 5,000 less letters and emails I'd have to answer. But the fact is, people write in, well, they've had more platinum albums, they've sold, and that's important, but it's not going to tell the story in that committee. Yeah. And so we put these names up. Obviously, if there are 40 people, theoretically, we could have 120 nominees. We don't, because there's duplications. Sure. And sometimes people just second something that's come ahead of them. We get a Bible every year. It has every artist that's eligible for the first year and that year, and then it has all the artists that have been nominated in the past and anybody who we missed. So it's a very big Bible. It takes most of the day, this process, and we usually have a number of, it's an iterative process of voting, getting it down to 15 candidates. Those 15 candidates are then sent to a committee that's a voting committee of, this year it was 680 people. Okay. Everybody that's a living inductee gets to vote. And then everybody else is a musician, writer, critic, professor of music, person in the industry, all very knowledgeable. People, as I said, all these emails and letters I got, I would explain this to them, but everybody feels that individually, personally, they can define rock and roll, and they know who should be in it. They know who changed their lives. Sure. Even if a person had one song or one record, that's who should be in there. So a lot of the emails I got would start out, "Dear asshole," and go downhill from there and get worse. My favorite ones, I think of all time, those I got the last week I was running the museum. It said, "Dear Terry," and it was written very large scrawl, as it often is. It said, "Dear Terry, thank you so much for responding to my dumbass letter about why Rush wasn't inducted. I'm so glad to see they're going to be inducted this year," and you mentioned the rest of the artists. They're wonderful too. "I will now live up to my promise, which I said I would bring my family to the Rock Hall when Rush finally got inducted. Blah, blah, blah. P.S. Please do not respond to this letter." And I kept it. It's the only one I kept. Yeah. In fact, they made a joke when my farewell party, the lady who runs our education program, Dr. Anke, she emceed it, and she said, and she had made up all these things to roast me a little bit. She said, "In fact, here, we're going to throw up on the screen the book that Terry has just published. It's a compendium of letters to the president of the Rock Hall, and called Dear Asshole." So anyway, it is, for those who are wondering, it is a very legitimate process. Is it perfect? No, and it's subjective because there are no statistics. There aren't number of games won, touchdowns thrown, home runs hit. That's not in there, and it's never going to be in there. Now, there are other categories of early influence and musical excellence, which covers those who came before, and largely African Americans. Homage to African Americans, the foundation of this music, because it is drum beats out of Africa. And then also musical excellence are songwriters, DJs, sidemen, things, and that's all done by committees. And it's a small committee, and they meet a couple times, and they get on the phone, and they come up with a slate of people every year, and they vote internally, and then that goes through the whole board to see if it's approved, and it winds up in there. This year, for instance, with Quincy Jones, overdue, but getting in, that sort of thing. And again, it's sort of like I tell people, just because they can get in the first year, it's not over. Now, the fans and the artists often feel like, that's it, I'm done. I'm not talking to those motherfuckers anymore, because I should have gotten in this year. So that's the way that sort of plays out. It's very emotional. There's a lot of passion involved. Sure. Which tells you how much the music means to everybody, which is the good news, I mean, if they didn't care, that's when they don't write the emails and the letters anymore, that's when they're in trouble. Yeah.
So aside from the process of choosing who's going in, what was the most challenging part of your job?
First of all, fundraising. There's a legacy of giving money to orchestras and art museums. It's not that old. It's only 100 years old, 120 years old, at least in America. And there's a philanthropic part of America that people don't realize, that philanthropy is so much different in America than it is around the world. The heritage and legacy of giving money to not-for-profits, to art museums, et cetera, it's not that common, because much of that's funded by governments around the world. The idea of something called a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, when it was built, mostly the business plan looked at the fact that it would be sustained by people coming through the door. The problem is when you look at the breadth of programming we do, particularly our educational programs, which are never going to be sustainable on revenues they bring in, but really validate the museum in a great way to show the history of this music and its import and impact, and the fact that we use music at the Rock Hall to teach math, science, social studies. That comes through the power of the music to get the attention of people or students of all ages. You've got to have different revenue streams, and that means development and fundraising. And that is always hard. It's gotten harder in recent years with the economy and everything. We've actually had our best years in recent years, and we leverage the inductions to do that as best we can. We try to sell lots of tables and tickets and sell a lot more tickets than we spend money. These shows are very expensive to do. Yeah. This year they're in LA. They'll be back in Cleveland. They're in Cleveland every 3 years. And we hope starting in 2017 they'll be in Cleveland every other year. But it eats you alive to do these shows.
Sure.
Selling, we have, basically you're looking at selling about $7 or $8 million worth of tickets to do the show. And that's a lot of tables and rubber chickens and things. And we try. So, that fundraising, certainly not finding artifacts, but obtaining them, and particularly having them given to the museum, because artists recognize the value of them, collectors recognize the value of them. We're surrounded here by a lot of stuff, and this is somewhat a lifetime of collecting. Artists, there's no tax advantage to an artist. If Bruce Springsteen gives us that, I guess it's a quasi-Fender of some sort that you see all the time, he would get the value of that beat-up guitar.
Sure.
He would not get the market value, the legacy value of the fact that it belonged to Bruce Springsteen. If he gives it to you and you give it to me, you get a $3 million tax deduction. He gets a $500, something like that. Yeah. So many of these folks recognize that they're probably not going to be extraordinarily wealthy at the end of their lives, or they're already gotten to the point where they're getting near the end of their lives. They're not extraordinarily wealthy.
Sure.
And these items represent either cash flow to them by selling it, or something in their will for their kids, because there won't be any money.
Sure.
And they know the kids very likely to sell them too. Acquiring meaningful artifacts is always a challenge. But again, we've done a good job of fundraising. We've done a good job of curating the museum. So those are probably those challenges. And to your point, getting back to just trying to explain to the world how the process works for inductions. And by its very nature, you're creating two classes of citizens. You've got the museum is mostly about the other class, those who aren't inducted.
Sure.
But once you say there are some that are lifted above the others, it presents a certain tension that never goes away until they're inducted.
Until they're in, right.
And as I say, fans and artists both are upset about that, for the most part. So.